Hi everyone, I'm Jennifer Morrison. Welcome back to my 4-part series, Intro into Colored Pencils. In the first video, I talked a little bit about why I love to work with colored pencils, and I showed you some of the supplies that I use in my drawings. And once you have your supplies, you obviously have to know what to do with them. And it can be a bit daunting as a beginner to open up this perfect set of beautiful colored pencils and think, now what? Or you might attempt a drawing and be disappointed that it doesn't meet your expectations or look like another colored pencil artist that you may have seen. It can be so helpful to begin by learning what your pencils can do and how they perform on different types of paper. Today, I want to introduce you to some simple techniques that you can use with your colored pencils in order to get you started. Anytime I get a new set of pencils, I like to start out by creating swatches. This helps me learn about the colors and characteristics of the pencils in the set. Be aware that your pencils can look very different on different types of paper. Here you can see me testing on Strathmore Bristol Smooth, Bristol Vellum, watercolor paper, printmaking paper, and museum mounting board. I am using 3 different Lyra Rembrandt polycolor pencils: dark carmine, delft blue, and sap green. Notice how the colors appear darker on the more textured papers than they do on the Bristol Smooth. This is because the pencils deposit more pigment per layer on these papers. The texture of the paper almost grabs the pencil pigment, and you can feel the difference when you're drawing on them. All of these papers are really good quality and will produce a beautiful result. Every colored pencil artist tends to have their own favorites depending on their process and techniques they like to use. You will want to try out a few different papers and choose the one that you are most comfortable with. Ultimately, I like to swatch my colors on the paper I'm going to be using for my drawing. In this case, it's the Strathmore Museum mounting board. Here is a swatch that I made for the Dahlia drawing, and I'm using this in the series. I always create a swatch or a color palette before I start drawing. I like to think that if the colors look good together on the palette, they're going to look good together on my drawing. Next, I'm going to introduce you to a few of my favorite techniques. Up first is indenting. One of my favorite techniques for you to try is to use a sharp pencil to indent the paper. When you go over the indented area with your pencils, the pigment won't stick there. You can create long lines or short dots and dashes. Sometimes I just dot all over an area to create texture. This is something that I did recently when I drew these oranges to get texture all over the surface of the orange. I mainly use my white pencil for this technique, but you can use any color. Here you can see me using yellow, or even something called a stylus or an embossing tool. And I used the indenting technique on my Dahlia drawing to create the veins that run down the center of some of the petals. These lines are really important for creating a 3D effect to my drawing. Another one of my favorite tools to use in my colored pencil work is an electric eraser. You can use an eraser for so much more than fixing mistakes. I like to use mine to create texture and depth of color, clean up my edges, and brighten highlights. Here I've created 2 different swatches of color. In the first swatch, I used several layers of sap green. In the second, I started out with a layer of white and then added my sap green on top. And what I want you to notice is how much brighter the second swatch is when I use the electric eraser on it. By adding the layer of white pencil first, you can just ensure that you're going to be able to brighten it back up to near white later on. So you want to do that in any of the areas where you might want to highlight on your drawing. And there's nothing wrong with the first swatch either. You don't always want to put a layer of white down first, just where you're going to want those bright highlights, because notice how much texture the eraser creates. I can go over this entire swatch with the second color and create some really nice depth in this swatch. I have found that using this technique really enhances the realism of my drawings, because rather than having one solid color, I've got this really nice blend. And of course, you can use the eraser to actually erase. Messy edges are a no-no when it comes to realistic drawing, and an electric eraser really cleans them up perfectly. On to blending. When you think about colored pencil work, you might imagine a drawing that has a very grainy finish. Take a look at a few of my finished drawings. As you can see, they are smooth and painterly looking. This is because I take my time to blend carefully. There are several ways you can blend colored pencil. Here I've created 3 light swatches using the Delft blue pencil. I'm going to blend the first swatch by simply layering and layering and layering. I like to start off with lighter layers and then increase my pressure as I add more pigment. This is called burnishing. And you can see after several minutes, I have a nice smooth finish. A second way to blend is with a blender pencil like this Lyra Rembrandt Splendor. This blender works similarly to burnishing, only these blender pencils are unpigmented. I added a bit more pigment to the swatch and then used the blender pencil to get rid of the graininess. You can go back and forth between your blender pencil and your colored pencils until you're happy with your coverage. My favorite way to blend, and a big part of my process, is to use a solvent. Again, I'm adding a bit more pigment to the swatch. The solvent will work by breaking down the binders in the pigment, and you need to make sure you have enough pigment on the paper for it to do its job. You will want to look for an odorless paint thinner or odorless mineral spirits. I used this Dahlia Romney solvent in my drawing, and I'm applying it with a Princeton Velvet Touch blender brush. You just want a firm bristled brush to apply the solvent. Simply dip the paintbrush into the solvent and then dab it off on an old cloth. You want your brush to be fairly damp but not wet. Otherwise, it can remove too much of the pigment from your drawing and dilute the vibrancy. Notice how the solvent dissolves the pencil pigment to create a nice smooth layer. After I have blended with solvent, I let the paper dry completely for a few minutes and then add a few more layers of pencil. This is when I would adjust my colors and add details. This was just a sampling of some of my favorite colored pencil techniques that you can begin to practice with right away. As you gain experience, you will begin to develop your own techniques, which can be a lot of fun. In the next video, I will show you my Dahlia drawing from start to finish and give you even more tips to help you get started. I am happy to respond to questions in the comments, and thank you for watching.